morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is, wherever you are right now. Thank you for tuning in to the Conversations with Dr. Don show. The show is produced and broadcast from the Portland, Oregon area. And for your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about whatever it is we've decided to talk about. And I'm smiling now because I always blow this opening line. Tonight we'll be talking about neighbors for clean air. Boy, that's a global sort of a topic, and we will learn more about what's meant by that. Neighbors for clean air. My guest is Mary Pendeto. Did I pronounce that right?
Pivoto.
I was a typo. Pivoto. Thank you. And I won't do that again. So as you know, the first part of the show is what I call the Who Are You segment, where I talk to you about who you are, what's on your mind, where you came from, personal stuff, but not too personal, so that people have an idea why you say what you say during the rest of the show. In the second segment, we'll be talking about neighbors for clean air, and I got a bit of an outline of the things you'll be talking about, and that's a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to need 3 hours. You ready?
I am ready, yes.
And occasionally, I forgot to warn you, sometimes a guest is so fascinated with their image on the monitor, and so they're talking to me, but they're watching themselves on the monitor.
I'd rather not look.
You'll be fine. You'll be photogenic. All right. Okay, my viewers have seen me talk about my personal stuff over 1 million times over the years. So we'll go right to you. And if I were to ask your best friend, Mary, who is Mary? What would your best friend say? Be your best friend. Mary is?
Well, I'd hope they'd say that I'm a good mother. I definitely, at this time, identify with, the role that I play as mother for my 3 children, and that's certainly also been sort of my defining network of friends is, through the social network of my children. So I feel like that's a really key piece of who I am these days.
So that's what your family would say Mary is, and I know the rest of it. Okay.
And I think I would also say I think they also see me as a community activist and a person who often does think a little bit more politically and globally in our group about things that are happening. And I tend to be at this time of year, especially as ballots are dropping and people are, scrambling to get their ballots in the last minute. I get lots of phone calls from my friends to ask me who to vote for or who, what to say. So I think I've become a bit of a private consultant for a lot of folks on sort of the political world in a very unconstructed and unofficial way. A lot of people look up to you?
That's a tough question.
That's a very tough question. I admire and love the people that will just look me straight in the eye.
Mm-hmm. Boy, you should be in this president. No, we don't want to go there. I'm political, too political. So is Dr. Donahoe, who referred you to me. He's a lovely human being. Mm-hmm. And where were you born?
I was born in a small town called Worthington, Minnesota.
Minnesota?
Yeah.
Oh, how long did you live there?
Well, I lived in Worthington for the first 4 years of my life, and then my family moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Uh-huh. And I lived there until about 18. Then I returned to Minnesota for college. So.
Uh-huh. All right. Anything significant about your national or cultural heritage, anything like that, or you're just plain American white bread?
Yeah, very European-centric. My father actually was adopted. He was adopted into a family with strong German roots. My maiden name is Schlick. On my mother's side, also European-centric, with roots that go back, deep into the history of American emigration, Irish and English mostly.
Mm-hmm. You got a kind of a bit of a mixture there, at least, huh? Well, I'll forgive you for not having any red or black.
You know, I don't know, but it hasn't come up in our family trees, so not sure that that means that it's not there.
A religious preference, do you have one?
I was
you don't have
raised,
to answer that.
yeah, I mean, I was raised Catholic, so I think I have a
Been there, done that.
yeah, but I do think I have sort of a Christian sensibility. You know, I relate to, I think, the Christianity in many ways that a lot of friends of mine who were raised or come from Jewish ethnicity sort of identify, you know, culturally with it, but maybe don't rigidly follow it. So I think that I've become very open to a broader concept of religion and spirituality in my adult life since then. But
And were you raised with a different religious perspective than you have now?
well, I always joke with I'm the youngest of 4 children in my family, and when my family of origin, very Catholic. When they were married, my parents married into the Catholic Church and ascribed to Catholic doctrine, and my older siblings all went to Catholic school actually for much of their elementary school. And it was at the time that we moved from Minnesota to Milwaukee that we ended up in, you know, that was when they left the Catholic school. And so I always joke with my family and my siblings that you were raised Catholic and I wasn't. And there was a lot of Catholicism in their life, and it was very centered in the life. As I got older, my mother especially really moved away from the Catholic Church for her own personal reasons, but was very spiritually driven, and in fact became a minister of her own church when she was 60. You know, she's just sort of constantly a seeker and on a spiritual journey that I think was profound to me, to see that process of, you know, maybe moving away from one doctrine but not moving away from, you know, still centering her spirituality being really important. And we've all, I mean, my siblings and I, we were all in very different religious, you know, spiritual paths. I think there's some sort of ethos there that ascribes to some higher power that, you know, we all believe in at some level.
You mentioned spirituality, and I've questioned my guests occasionally, what does that mean for you? Because I get all sorts of answers, and I have my own, stole a lot of the messages I've heard, and I have my own view of spirituality. What do you mean by you're very spiritual or spirituality?
For me,
yes.
For me, what that means is the sense that there is a purpose outside of my own making that drives my life, that I can, if, you know, with some concentration, with some focus, can potentially tap into. It's the creative energy, I think, of our world. And so there's just, I guess it's a sense of, I'm not sure if I really like the word higher purpose, but it's just a sort of sense of something beyond, you know, the experiences we understand, our human experience, that is also at play in our lives. And it's, to me, it's just a constant question as much as an answer to all of that, but it's one that helps center me, and I just, it's just always kind of a question that I like to continue to ask myself.
Is there a feeling associated with being spiritual or experiencing spirituality? Is it sort of a feeling?
Yeah, I guess to me it's a practice as much as a feeling. It's a way for me to kind of get outside of my own head and my own day-to-day experiences. And I have a practice. I do some reading. A lot of it right now is centered around some Buddhist teachers, or, you know, but I'll pick from a really wide variety of things. It just happens to be where I'm at. And it'll usually prompt me to just do my journaling and writing. And so it's just a way to, you know, I think just trying to tap into that stream of consciousness that I feel does come from maybe outside of, you know, my own brain or intellectual capacity.
Yeah, it comes to me in terms of I'm not thinking anymore when I'm having this experience, which I characterize as spirituality. It's like a sense of timelessness occurs for those few seconds or whatever it takes for me to experience my being in this. And being is in my totality of my being and not knowing what it's about. As you can tell, I'm a recovering Catholic, and you can see those holes in my chest from too many mea culpas. You know? You've heard those out.
Yes.
So I don't know when it's going to occur, but I'm very fortunate when it does occur, or when I occur. In those moments, I cherish them. And occasionally I can dig back, sometimes in the distant past and sometimes in the recent past, and think about where I was at a certain time. Like one of my favorite places is in a meadow in Yellowstone. There's a favorite rock that I love, and I like to be there first thing in the morning. And when my wife is with me, I tell her, go ahead, I'll be back. I'll be back in a little while. And she'll come back and guess how long it's taken me to be and to experience a spiritual being. Oh, I'm interviewing you. I'm not talking about me right now.
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. And how about your education, your formal education? I read a little bit about what you wrote. You wrote about your education. Will you talk about it for a bit?
Yeah, I mean, my college degree is a Bachelor of Arts in History from Macalester College. I, very much came from the liberal arts, sensibility and discipline, and I think that sort of matched with my upbringing. I was raised before my mother was a minister. My father and mother were both teachers, educators, and that was just a high priority in our household. Was not rigidly academic, but sort of appreciation for learning, good grammar, very high concern for my father. So it just was always.
Did you guys hug when you were small, little girl?
I feel like we did. I think I remember being very affectionate with both my parents. Yes.
You're fortunate. And other education beyond your university work? School of Hard Knocks?
School of Life. My children are a constant source of education for me, I have to say. And, I joke with all of my partners, whether it's, I do a lot of collaboration these days with the Lewis and Clark environmental law departments, as well as atmospheric chemists and environmental scientists at PSU, Portland State University. So I'm kind of constantly joking with them about when they're going to give me their either an honorary law degree or science degree from one of these because of the amount of time that we do in this. But so this whole air world has been incredibly education, big learning curve for me. I think prior to that, I mean, I came out of, again, history major out of college, and I went straight into Nike, doing marketing work for Nike. So I think I got my business degree at Nike and my law degree, in the clean air work. So.
Okay, you've had an interesting life so far.
I've had a great life so far. Yes.
And you mentioned your 3 kids.
Yes.
Can you say a few words about them?
So I have 3 daughters, and they range in age 21, 19, and 12. And small anecdotal fact is none of them were born in the U.S. They happen to all of my pregnancies occurred when we were living overseas. So the first 2 were born in Germany while we were working for Adidas there, and then we returned to Europe after being back in the States for a while. And sure enough, a couple weeks after we got there, I was pregnant with my 3rd daughter. So they're all European born. She was born, the last one was born in Italy.
Interesting, yeah. They're in school now?
So I have 2 in college and 1 a 7th grader.
What are they going to do?
What are they going to do? My oldest seems to be very interested in, design. I would say all of my children this generation of kids are really seeing the challenges that are facing them. So I think that in many ways they're more practical than I was. You know, I went to school and didn't give much thought about what I was going to do for the rest of my life. And so my oldest is very interested in product design, but she's interested in it as a problem-solving tool of our, you know, our built environment and sustainability and this sort of consumerism that dominates. I think she's really interested in how we might be able to design our way, you know, use that same positive energy around consumerism towards designing our way out of some of these problems. My second daughter, I think, has adapted or adopted much more of the sort of advocacy ethos, although she also has, since she was, I feel like since she could talk, she has always wanted to teach and take care of younger children especially, but she's more now focused on, you know, kind of the environmental science and policy world again, I think, to try and get us, you know, figure out how we plan our way out of this. And my youngest, also very early age, science has been her kind of driving thing, and she wants, you know, she wants to invent something, and she wants to study science to figure out how we solve these big problems. So they've all sort of, yeah, they've all internalized some environmental ethos, I think, in 3 very different paths.
Okay. And you mentioned working at Adidas and Nike, and did you move past that to do the work you're doing now?
Well, what happened was I worked at Nike, then we ended up getting hired by Adidas to go, and we were moved to Germany to work at Adidas, my husband and I. And I had been working at Adidas for about 3 years when I got pregnant with my first daughter in Germany. And the German system is very different than America. So when a working woman gets pregnant, she is allowed time off for that.
Wasn't that unique?
Yes, she's allowed a certain amount of compensation. I think in my first year of the pregnancy, because of the, you know, generous benefits you get in terms of vacation time, by taking the vacation time, by taking the allotment of time that's allowed for the actual finishing, you actually get out 6 weeks prior to your due date. You're officially on maternity leave, and then 8 weeks after the child is born, and then your 6 weeks plus of vacation. I mean, I had about 6 months of full pay the year that my first daughter was born.
Sounds like socialism to me.
Yes, it is, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
And then you get 3 years of guarantee of your job level, job pay back when you're ready to return. So you have up to 3 years.
I wasn't aware of that part.
Yes. So and you, so you can kind of walk away with some comfort that, you know, you're going to have enough time to take care of this child before it becomes school age, and you know, and you get, we called it diaper money. You get a little bit of stipend, but you also, you know, you get the wonderful health care benefits. You know, that also is fully taken care of. And so, and then that 3 years, should you have another child, which I did about 2 years and 4 months after the first daughter was born, my second daughter was born, and then the 3-year clock just starts, it resets and starts over. So, so I was on this maternity program at the time that we returned to America, because at that point we had been in Germany almost 6 years, and my husband, there was an opportunity for him to do something different, and he decided to move back to America. So I basically left, my status was I was still on maternity leave, I was still an employee of Adidas, and I came back to America, and it wasn't until I got back here that I realized that, you know, you might as well have signed a death certificate if you took 5 years off, you know, from working with children, you know, that stayed home. And plus we moved quite a bit, and we ended up moving to Italy sort of after a lot of moving around, and I was actually going to consider going back to work when we were moving to Italy with the company my husband was working with at that point, but I found out I was pregnant again. So I decided that, you know, moving country, being pregnant, having a third child probably wasn't where I wanted to restart my career. And so it wasn't until I came back again to America and realized, well, if I thought 5 years was bad for your career, you know, at this point it was about 12 years since I had actually worked, and the Great Recession hit about that. We moved back in 2007.
Yeah.
And so after kind of getting settled and things all, you know, kind of settling. So I will say, I mean, I guess that's a long answer to answer the question, but
It's interesting.
you know, at that point, I wasn't seeing a whole lot of career options for a woman who had, you know, not worked for that long a period of time, plus the recession, plus being in a market like Portland that is, you know, somewhat limited. But, you know, I wouldn't say that that was the driver for me on the air. I just think that as the air work came, as I kind of back-ended into this, it was filling, you know, I think it was filling a great need in myself to be working on something and productive. I was really ready to take something on, and so I figured out everything in terms of kind of putting back a career and sort of professional, except for that paid part of it. But other than that, it's been a great, yeah, it's been a great, you know, work for professionally for me.
What's your political persuasion nowadays? You're left, right, center, or what?
Well, boy, in Portland, sometimes I feel like I'm center, like, you know, but I would say I mean, I identify strongly with democratic principles in general, and I'm registered as a Democrat, and I'm probably moderate by Portland you know, Portland mores, but I feel like.
How do you feel about Trumpenstein? I mean, Trump.
I have a really difficult time separating, you know, the person from the office and from the and I am just so horrified at the low standard of humanity that he represents that it's very difficult for me to even make any assessment sometimes of any policy or any actions that he's taken, because I just find him, I find him honestly very personally offensive in terms of his moral compass, his, you know, track record. So.
Some suggest that he has a personality disorder, at least one.
You're the psychologist. I have no qualifications to make a diagnosis.
Yeah, I would subscribe to that myself, because with the personality disorder, you're allowed to be any place or every place or whatever, because it's hard to talk about somebody in terms of what they're doing and what their goals are and that sort of a thing. And I don't think I remember, I haven't lived that long, presidents in the past who had this kind of a personality or character, so to speak. It's just scary. Of course, I confess to being a screaming left-wing liberal for all my life, like that. And as you can see, some of my signs I wear. But, okay, the difference between sympathy and empathy. Do you see a difference between those two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I've ever forced myself to define it, but I absolutely do see a difference between I certainly believe that empathy is an incredibly important characteristic to foster in both a public and private sort of way. I think it's, you know, it's incredibly important for us to be able to consider policy and consider decisions and consider things. And by empathy, to me, it represents being able to consider that there is a different point of view or a different perspective on something. I think it takes opening up your scope of how you might see what is true to be broader than your own experience. Whereas sympathy, I feel like it stays sort of grounded in your own experience, and you can sympathize and or feel for somebody, and yet still stay centered in sort of a I don't know, I guess a more singular perspective of the truth. But the empathy, I feel like you really have to go beyond and be willing to consider that there is more truth than you understand, and in order to truly empathize with, you know, other people and other ideas.
Yeah, for me, I've gone through this a lot of times with different people, depending on the guest, is whether I'll ask this kind of a question, is to see you about to be in tears and sense that and feel that, rather than appreciate it intellectually. And that's a unique connection. I think it's vitally important for humans to be empathetic, even with culture influencing us from other directions and that sort of a thing. So that was my turn to stick my 2 cents in. So we're going to stop in a minute or two and then take a break and then come back and talk about your work, which is, I think, is tremendously important. Any persons alive today or from the past that you particularly admire or look up to? Any names come to mind? Sometimes a person would have 1 or 2, sometimes 3 or 4.
Wow, boy, I don't know where I would start or stop that list. I have tremendously been influenced, I think, by my family of origin. My father, who passed away 5 years ago, my sister's brother, my mother. You know, I think it all starts there, and with extended family that was all part of my upbringing. But beyond that, you know, teachers, I mean, I feel like I should have a, you know, easy list, but I just think there's just been so many.
Whoever asked you this kind of a question before.
Yeah, and I haven't really, I haven't cultivated that list. So, you know, it probably sounds really cliche, but I also believe, for me, as a segue, you know, just into the work and otherwise, you know, Barack Obama was incredibly influential. I can't, you know, I would love to be able to say I met him or knew him, but I remember, no, I haven't. But, you know, just having folks who have been out, I remember with his campaign and the kind of characteristics that I think, you know, he really brought to his campaign that transcended all of the other things that, you know, campaigns and politics and everything do. And there was an essence to him that was so strong that it really, I think, permeated all of his campaign work, to the point where I remember just feeling so motivated by you know, a person who called me up from his campaign, and instead of asking for money, asked me to help and to show up and volunteer, and I did. And, you know, he's the first campaign I went, you know, a presidential campaign that I went beyond writing a check for, and actually went and started walking, you know, knocking on doors and talking to people. And we were doing Get Out the Vote, so, you know, collecting ballots or encouraging people to get their ballots in. And, you know, just his ability to demonstrate the power of democracy and the power of, you know, individuals in this, really, I think he really broke down some of the barriers, or some of the really probably desensitizing that had happened, I think, for people in the political process up to that point, where people really didn't feel very connected in that political world, or their ability to impact it. And he certainly woke it up in, you know, woke it up in me. And so I assume that was also a big part of the power of his campaign.
Do you think he had a capacity for empathy?
Barack Obama?
Yes.
Yes. Very strongly.
You probably liked FDR too. It was before your time.
I was a history major. I know a bit about, but yeah. And
you have some qualities of Buddhism about you.
I don't know if I do. It resonates with me, but I'm not sure I can claim them, that I've internalized them.
I'm very flattered now and then when I have an occasional Buddhist or near Buddhist on my show, and they accuse me of having some of those qualities, and I glow.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it's about, but I have an idea.
Yeah.
So let's see if we can stop now, take a break, and then come back and we'll talk about Neighbors for Clean Air, and all the other things that you mentioned in my list of prompting questions.
All right.
Can we take a break, Mr. Director? So we're back. Thanks for staying tuned. And for you viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like my guest this evening about who she is as a unique, one-of-a-kind individual, and about whatever it is we've decided to talk about tonight. And I made it through with the opening with that, but the second time I blew it. It's a fun thing with me. So let's start off with, you talked about you're an accidental activist. What does that mean, accidental activist?
It means that I find myself now working on environmental policy and advocacy, but I didn't study environmental science, and I didn't study law, and I didn't, I was working, my professional career was in consumer product marketing, so I, found myself one day searching for the farm to school lunch program that they have in the Portland Public Schools, because I wanted to find out, what days or what things were on the school menu. And instead, as the Google will often, the internet will often do to us, it gives us what we don't ask for. And I came across industrial air pollution in schools. And I looked, and it was a very interesting study published. USA Today was the platform. It was US EPA, actually this research group out of the University of Massachusetts Amherst that was looking at the aggregate problem of industrial pollution, and USA Today had said, well, could we look at single locations like use America's schools? So they looked at, I think, 127,000 schools across America, and they ranked these 127,000 schools for their with EPA data on emissions inventories from industry. And so you could put into this, you could put your school name and town that your school was located in and a search engine. And when I did that, I thought, well, I'll do that. It's my neighborhood school, see how we look. And I knew I live in the Northwest District in Portland, close in Portland, and we are, a block off of the industrial sanctuary. There is a designation for heavy industry.
Yes.
And I knew from neighborhood, the neighborhood association there was a group that had for a long time been very concerned about some of the industry that was right near the neighborhood. So I thought, well, I'll put in Chapman Elementary School, Portland, Oregon. And the picture that came back was that we were ranked in the bottom 2% in the country due to air pollution, the industry air pollution with the industry that this neighborhood group had long been concerned about. And, my first thought was I'd known that effort, that this group had done, and I'd known that they'd kind of constantly hit this wall of, even sometimes our Department of Environmental Quality would say, yeah, we have an air pollution problem, but it's not industry. In Oregon, we don't really, industry's not the problem, it's our transportation, it's cars, it's, other things. And I thought, well, this is a game changer, though, because it isn't to say that there aren't those other air pollution sources, but if you looked only at industry, the fact that our industry was enough of a, was heavy enough and big enough that it could be ranking us this poorly in the country, seemed like a game changer of like saying, okay, well now they'll do something about it. And
about when was this?
That was in 2009. So, so I will say, fast forward to about a year ago, and actually this year, we're actually finally writing the new rules for permits, industry permits in Portland, in Oregon, actually. So it wasn't quite as fast as I thought it would happen, but it's happened, right? Like we're going to get new permit rules because that did illustrate a massive gap. I would say I've actually started to kind of walk myself back from the idea of being an accidental activist, because I think when you're a mother, a parent, and you see something that puts your kids at risk, that's not accidental. That's kind of what we do every day, is we manage risk.
And you have an empathy gene, we know that.
Yeah, so you're, there's nothing accidental about deciding I need to protect my kids from something. And
yes.
I will say, my husband, I had a little bit of a pre-event to this, because 5 years before that, 5, maybe a little bit longer, my husband, who grew up in Louisiana, and he actually grew up in Lake Charles, between Lake Charles and Houston, and it's actually, his dad was a chemical engineer.
Pretty industrial there.
It's actually called Cancer Alley.
Yes.
And because it's a lot of chemical companies down there, and
a lot of poor people too.
And a lot of very poor communities are surrounding these areas. And he was, a runner. I mean, he's been running, he ran his first marathon, I think, when he was 14. And, it wasn't until he was 35 years old, and we were living in Santa Cruz, and, we've got 2 children, and they ended up finding a tumor on his lung. And, he wasn't a smoker. He wasn't, there was really no explanation to this. Thankfully, they didn't really know what it was, honestly. They sent it to first the Stanford lab, and then they sent it to the Mayo Clinic, and they said basically we've probably seen 3 or 4 of these before, but they, they ended up having to take the lobe of lung that it was attached to. It was about the size of a golf ball, and I remember thinking even then, like, I bet it's related to where he grew up. And I certainly, when I moved back to Portland and heard about this community, neighborhood group that had found, like, all these heavy metals in the dust, and had done some research into finding out, that it did look like these heavy metals were coming into our community and neighborhood. And then I see this other report that shows that, wow, these emissions are high enough to make us, on the national scale. It resonated with me. Like, I don't want my children, in 30 years from now, to be dealing with some horrible disease because of the place that we chose to raise them. And so that's where it really started, and trying to figure out, like, okay, 40 years after the Clean Air Act, why are we still dealing with, basically 100-year-old industrial, technology and pollution?
I'm not as far left as I sound sometimes.
and again, this is probably where I'm a little bit right of certainly the left center in Portland, because I'm not an anti-capitalist. I actually, and I feel like it's also not only been informed by my own benefits of capitalism, but also been informed by living in a European system where I can see that actually socialism and capitalism don't have to be on the opposite, they can actually intersect.
Yes.
And you can use the power of resources to benefit the public good, as long as you put those rails, as long as you put that intentionality into it. And I think, and as long as you continue to value the public good as an important community, social responsibility,
yeah,
exactly.
Bottom line.
So I'm a huge believer. I lived through my experience with working at Nike, and Adidas, you know, lived through big times when, you know, you figured out like, well, we can't have small children sewing soccer balls, you know, that's not okay. And so, and you know, in America, there was a huge push in the 90s around, you know, the exploitation of cultures in the athletic world and the benefits, you know, the people who are reaping the benefits of that. So there was also a huge campaign led by Jesse Jackson about diversifying, you know, these athletic companies, and that they should be, you know, that people of color shouldn't just be the exploited commodity of this athletic industry. They should also be a beneficiary of it, and not just the high name athletes who are, you know, kind of win the lottery. But also within these companies, there was a pretty transformative push that Jesse Jackson's organization did to, you know, get these companies to kind of look at who their employees were. So I guess I do believe in the power of social capitalism, and I guess I found it was astounding to me to take a look at this problem of industrial pollution in my neighborhood, and then to scale it out and realize, okay, well, it's actually a problem all across Oregon, that we actually not only don't require innovation of these companies, we almost incentivize for them to stay stuck, you know, in their, and so, you know, the company that was in my neighborhood that was so problematic was 100+ years old. And, you know, some of the things that we ended up successfully being able to work with them, convince them to come to the table, and really we could do things better than they were doing it.
What's the table, local or state or regional?
This happened to be, this was our first work. The first work that started me in this was to basically sit down with ESCO Steel. They were a steel manufacturing facility in Northwest Portland, and to negotiate a good neighbor agreement. And the basis of the good neighbor agreement was we did engineering analysis. Actually, the state paid for one, but ESCO also paid for their own independent engineer to do analysis of what they called alternatives analysis. Basically, you know, what could they do differently at that factory to reduce emissions? And
were they showing some social responsibility?
They were showing, yeah. I mean, it took a little bit of, you know, I would like not to say shaming, but you know, we were able to get it to critical mass where they felt like, okay, and they're, you know, they're a Portland family, and it's a family-owned business, and so I think that they were sensitive to that sort of public pressure about their, you know, were they doing something that they could be doing better?
And a few people like you.
There were a few, and maybe the 3,000 behind me. The
yes,
other, you know, we did petitions, and we had families showing up, and the kids, and you know, we told them, you know, we understand you're doing everything legal. I mean, that's the problem with air pollution in Oregon. Is there are statistics that show that it causes up to 460 deaths a year are attributed to our air pollution, and it's pretty much all 100% legal. And so that was the case with ESCO, is we're not saying you're not, you know, that you're doing anything illegal, we're just saying you could be doing better. And so we were able to identify these, you know, 17 actions, you know, what they could do that went beyond their requirements, and that became the basis of saying, you know, I don't think this is just one company in one neighborhood. I think, you know, the permitting process in Oregon is really broken.
You had a beginning.
Yeah, and so, but it took us a long time to get the kind of critical mass to really fix the whole system, like we finally are doing this year, you know, to start from here. But this was where it started, was a very kind of neighborhood, local.
It feels good doing this work?
I love this work. I do.
Of course, I'd never guess it.
I do. I mean, one, I get to learn a lot. I get to be with really smart people that I really enjoy, and it's problem-solving work. It feels very, when you're doing it at the hyper-local level that we do, you're really finding commonalities between, you know, a business and the community, and figuring out opportunities to do things better and to build better understanding of what, you know, between these two entities. And I've really, really enjoyed that work a lot and learned a lot.
So we've probably got another 10 minutes left. That's why I said we needed 4 hours. But we've got some things that you mentioned here in your list, and perhaps we should invite you to figure which of these you want to address in the next 10 minutes or so. You want to read them, or shall I?
Well, I think that I can probably remember a little bit.
Okay.
I would just say again, our work stemmed from this understanding that, you know, when I started this work, I saw this, it was clear to me that if you look to the regulations, there was nothing in the regulations that told us that if companies were compliant or, you know, or were legally operating, that was safe. That there was this massive gap between, you know, what was regulated and what the compliance standards were versus what we, you know, a health standard, basically, to understand
what you really need.
What, you know, what is safe. Does that mean, okay, does that mean we have clean, safe air? And so in the last 8 years or so of doing this work, you know, we finally moved towards a place where we are getting health-based standards into our air emissions regulations. So the Cleaner Air Oregon program, for example, is that. And there's still a public comment period that's going to be open this summer for, you know, your folks that are watching this, if they go to cleanerair-oregon.com. And I think anytime between now, although the official public comment period I think opens June 15th, they can weigh in, they can give their opinion to the state about what they, you know, how this program ultimately plays out and is finalized. You know, are we going to have strong, enforceable health standards? Or is that going to be the driver of the way we regulate industry air pollution? Likewise, we've also come to realize that industry is problematic, especially the closer you are to industry, but ubiquitously, we also have a huge problem for the same reason that, you know, the use of older diesel engines is not regulated in our state. Our neighboring states have, you know, this is where, when I talk about that metric of the really health, 460 deaths a year attributed to the continued reliance on these older diesel engines in our state. And, you know, just to put that in perspective, that's more than traffic fatalities. So, you know, the air coming out of the tailpipe's more dangerous than getting, you know, than the people that die by traffic fatalities. It's, you know, more than homicides, you know, as well. I mean, it's just, we lose too many people to a really, really preventable problem because the diesel engine standards are over a decade old. Like the new engine standards reduce 99% of this problem.
So
it's just the continued reliance on the older and not insisting that we move that forward.
So the political climate nowadays in this area we're talking about is positive and encouraging you to show some signs of winning and going in the right direction, huh?
Yeah, I think absolutely. We're finding, especially in Oregon, political climate.
Left-wing Oregon.
And, you know, in fact, possibly there might be a case for saying that the federal climate is helping us in Oregon because, you know, I think that there is something where it's so clear that our federal administration is no longer to be trusted. Whereas, you know, I think historically in Oregon, there's been a little bit of pushback, especially, you know, Portland and Salem are two different places, right? And all of our state, all of our air emissions are regulated at the state level, which means Salem. Sure. And even if our DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, they could pass a whole bunch of standards, the state legislature still needs to fund that agency, and that's usually their indirect way of keeping the agency under control. Mm-hmm. But historically, the state has also said, hey, we don't need to go beyond the federal government. You know, they're so strong and they're, you know, so dogmatic around this stuff. But, you know, a lot of stuff is getting rolled back at the federal level, even as we speak. You know, emission standards for even our passenger vehicles. And so there is more and more impetus, I think, in our state leadership to say, okay, we need to make sure we're doing our job. And it just is becoming more and more clear how much Oregon has lagged in this. And we really, the diesel is a real black eye, I think, for us because of how much Washington State and California have really addressed it, because it is probably the biggest significant driver of not only the health risk, but you spoke to a really important point. Also the environmental justice component.
And
If
social
you are a person of color in the Portland metro area, and you live in a zip code that has a higher concentration of people of color than the average zip code might have in terms of racial makeup, diesel emissions, they've done analysis, Multnomah County Health, diesel emissions are 3 times higher in those zip codes where there's higher concentration of people of color. So even even though none of us are really safe from it, even then, you know, the risk if you're a person of color or low income is 3 times greater. And you know, unfortunately, I mean, there has been a lot that has been mobilized around industrial pollution and other, but it's an odd construct in Portland, especially, that industrial pollution is fairly equitably distributed. Like, you know, the environmental justice analysis doesn't support as directly that industry is impacting, you know, low income or populations of color as much as the diesel emission, because, you know, it's where our freeways are, it's where our freight transport are, and that's where we put our low income housing, and we put, you know, we have really some big issues around, and that has been identified for decades. And so in some ways I feel like it's been an environmental injustice that we've mobilized so much, and I am a strong believer that our industry permits needed to be improved and we needed to see movement there. But how have we not dealt with this long-standing problem of these diesel emissions in these neighborhoods that have impacted some of our most vulnerable populations? And it's true, I mean, even just school buses, I mean, it's taken us 12 years to change out, you know, to finally get a program that's going to see our school buses change, and that has really impacted a lot of our poorer and more rural communities as well.
What has caused this condition to exist for so long? And you see an improvement in the system of government and the people who are governing us moving in the right direction. You're hopeful that things are getting better so that we can take care of this problem sooner rather than later?
Well, it's already later. So, but I will say I'll just do a short answer to that one. Yes. Sure. That I do think the movement's in the right direction, and we're finally, you know, addressing it. Why? That's harder. It's harder to measure. It's not the type of pollution that you see, like the smog, when you can't see Mount Hood on what should be a beautiful day. It has been concentrated in areas. I don't think we really understood. The science has emerged. I think it's pretty solid now, but I think it, you know, in the last 10 years, it's really emerged to demonstrate the real health outcome problems that are associated with exposure to the diesel emissions. I'm not sure how Portland and Oregon, and frankly, you know, industry was very strong, but I also think what was missing in our advocacy that we got so fixated on, you know, one, pollutant reduction, carbon reduction, and sustainability, and left on the table this whole issue of, you know, health problems associated with air pollution. And I just think that, you know, I think we have seen a slow shift finally to look at people in Oregon in terms of environmental concerns, whereas, you know, historically we've really looked at preserving natural spaces and more of a conservation ethos. And I think we're finally starting to see, and I think it's, you know, also because our urban center has become such an important core piece of our sustainability and our ethos. But you have air pollution when you have urban centers, and I think we're now finally getting around to it. So I can't totally explain why we didn't. I'm just glad that we're identifying it and we're working on it, and I think our leaders are now seeing, like, you can't have you can't claim a strong sustainability ethos and leave off the fact that we're still allowing pollution to kill people and be okay with that.
Priorities depends on the ruling elite. The ruling system have confused what the priorities should be. Human welfare and human health should be the first priority. And too bad the kind of capitalism that we're experiencing now in our country, we have human welfare and social responsibility a little lower than it should be, I think. But they're going to yell at me unless we stop talking.
I'm done.
You're done. All right. So let's see, what can I say to you? It looks like it's close to time for us to stop visiting and get ready to say goodnight. Keep those pens and pencils handy because you may want to jot down something that we'll show you in the closing credits. Thanks for watching. I invite you to give us feedback, both positive and negative, about any aspect of the show, and I really mean it. But I got a few public service announcements that I want to run here and see. To watch my shows on the web, Google Don Baham YouTube. And I have another one coming up pretty quick. To learn more about humanists and humanism, you know I'm a humanist, go to AmericanHumanist.org, and there's a phone number. I love humanism. I'm a recovering Catholic. To learn more about the Alliance for Democracy, that's a great organization, go to the national website at the AllianceForDemocracy.org and the Portland, Oregon website at www.afd-pdx.org. And we got one more here, to learn more about the American Civil Liberties Union, my favorite organization. Without the American Civil Liberties Union, our civil liberties, I can't even say it, would be down the tubes. And what else do we need to say to you? Okay. End corporate personhood, I forgot that. We got to end corporate personhood so that we can say that corporations are not persons and money is not speech. Yes. Go to move-to-amend.org. And thanks for watching. And remember KFC, not Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dr. John's KFC, kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and be charitable to you too, and you too. My control room drives me nuts. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I hope you had a good time.
I did.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.